The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it froze. At the center of the most dangerous table in Manhattan, Ivana Aaliyah leaned in, her hands raised in a trembling, pleading gesture, and whispered 6 words in a dialect that hadn't been heard in this city for 50 years. The silverware stopped clinking, and the low hum of elite conversation vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Victor Sr., the silver fox patriarch whose predatory gaze usually dictated the room's heartbeat, slowly removed his sunglasses. His brow, heavily furrowed with decades of calculated suspicion, remained fixed on the young woman in the high-saturation red apron. Beside him, his mother, Rosa, sat in a state of jaw-dropped shock. Her pupils dilated as she clutched a heavy diamond necklace that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. "Bonera, signora. Benuta a New York," Ivana whispered, her voice small but clear. It wasn't the textbook Italian taught in schools. It was the raw, regional Sicilian of the Bolaro district, the language of home, of poverty, and of shared blood. To anyone else, it was just a greeting, but to the Valastros, it was a ghost calling from across the ocean. Dante Valastro narrowed his eyes, leaning forward from his dark silhouette to assess the threat. He was a man who saw every anomaly as a danger, yet here was a shy waitress, someone who spent her life trying to take up as little space as possible, shattering the equilibrium of his world with a few syllables. The bodyguards at the perimeter shifted, their hands twitching toward their jackets, sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere. Ivana's eyebrows arched upward in a look of pure desperation, her large, dark eyes searching Rosa's face for a sign of mercy. She knew she had broken every professional protocol, stepping out of the shadows of her own shyness to claim a heritage she wasn't supposed to have. For one heartbeat, the most powerful table in the room held its collective breath, caught between a violent reaction and a nostalgic revelation. The invisible girl had finally been seen. And in that moment of absolute stillness, the foundation of the Valastro Empire felt the first tremor of a connection that would change everything. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant acted as a silent boundary between the chaotic streets of Manhattan and a world where time seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and aged leather, illuminated by the amber glow of crystal chandeliers that cast long, flickering shadows against the dark wood paneling. This was the inner sanctum of the Valastro Syndicate, a place where business was conducted in hushed tones, and a single nod could alter the skyline of the city. The other patrons, hedge fund managers and old money socialites, spoke in whispers, instinctively aware that they were merely guests in a house that belonged to someone else. At the center of this quiet fortress sat the Den of Lions. Dante Valastro didn't just occupy the corner booth, he anchored the entire room, his presence creating a gravitational pull that even the most seasoned servers felt the moment they stepped onto the floor. His custom-tailored navy suit was as sharp as his gaze, a silver fox whose rugged, weathered face told the story of a man who had survived 1,000 storms to reach the top of his empire. He sat with a predatory stillness, his eyes narrowed and calculating, tracking every movement in the room with the practiced assessment of a man who saw threats before they even materialized. Beside him sat Rosa Valastro, the silent heartbeat of the family. She was the picture of silver-haired elegance, her neck draped in diamonds that caught the light with every subtle movement. Yet her eyes held a depth of old-world nostalgia that hinted at a life lived long before the skyscrapers and the syndicate. The power at Table 9 was not loud, it was heavy. It was in the way the bodyguards stood like statues near the entrance, and the way the restaurant's owner, Roberto, hovered at the edge of the kitchen, his face pale as he watched his staff navigate the minefield of the Valastro inner circle. For the men at this table, the restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a throne room, where loyalty was the only currency that mattered. To everyone else, it was a place of luxury, but to Ivana, as she adjusted her red apron and took a shaking breath, it felt like walking directly into a predator's cage, where a single misstep could be the end of everything. Ivana moved the gleaming aisles of the restaurant like a ghost in a red apron, a skill she had perfected over years of being told she was too quiet. To the high society patrons of the Upper East Side, She was merely a functional part of the furniture, an invisible hand that refilled water glasses and cleared away silver spoons without ever breaking the practiced silence of the room. But beneath the calm professional exterior of her crisp white shirt, Ivana's heart was a drum of constant, low-level anxiety. Every Tuesday night followed the same grueling rhythm. 10 hours on her feet at the restaurant, followed by a frantic subway ride home to pull an all-nighter over anatomy textbooks and pharmacology charts. Nursing school was more than a career path for her. It was a lifeline out of the crushing anonymity that had defined her family's existence since they arrived in the city. She could still see her grandmother's tired hands, calloused from 30 years in a garment factory, and it was that memory that pushed Ivana through the exhaustion. She wanted to be the one who finally stood on solid ground, the one who didn't have to shrink herself just to survive. Yet the financial burden felt like a rising tide, always an inch away from swallowing her whole. One missed shift or one bad tip could mean the difference between her next semester and a lifetime of clearing tables. Tonight, however, the usual fatigue was replaced by a cold, sharp fear. The air in the restaurant had changed the moment the black SUVs pulled up to the curb, and the rumors among the staff traveled faster than the appetizers. Roberto had already pulled her aside, his voice a frantic whisper as he adjusted her collar, warning her that the men at Table 9 weren't the usual hedge fund managers who complained about the vintage of their wine. They were the Valastros, the kind of men who didn't just own the room, they owned the people in it. As Ivana clutched her serving tray, her large, expressive eyes darted toward the corner booth where the silver fox sat in his tailored suit, his gaze like a predator waiting for a reason to strike. She felt smaller than ever, a tiny speck of red and white against the dark wood and heavy power of the syndicate. Her hands trembled as she straightened her spine, trying to remember the lessons of her grandmother, that even the most invisible person carries a story that can change the world. With a deep, shaky breath, she stepped out of the shadows and toward the table that would either break her spirit or set her free. The air in the front of the house shifted the moment the black SUVs pulled up to the curb. Roberto, usually a man of calm precision, was suddenly everywhere at once, his eyes darting from the silver-polished cutlery to the alignment of the chairs at the back corner booth. Table 9. He caught Ivana's arm as she adjusted a stray lock of hair. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tight with a warning he didn't need to speak. "The Valastros. Remember what I told you. Be a ghost. Be efficient. And whatever you do, do not break the rhythm of the table." Ivana felt the familiar, cold knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, the crushing weight of her own shyness making her breath shallow. She smoothed her deep red apron and stepped into the dining room just as the heavy oak doors swung open. The atmosphere didn't just change, it settled into a heavy, pressurized silence that seemed to push the oxygen out of the room. Dante Valastro entered first, a silver fox whose presence was a physical force. He moved with the slow, calculated grace of a predator who owned every square inch of the floor he walked on. But it was the woman beside him who commanded the true reverence of the room. Rosa Valastro walked with her head held high, her voluminous silver hair perfectly coiffed, shimmering under the light of the crystal chandeliers. She wore a black evening dress that seemed to absorb the light around her, save for the massive diamond teardrops at her ears and the heavy necklace that rested against her collarbone like a suit of armor. As they reached Table 9, the bodyguards fanned out, creating an invisible perimeter that marked the family as untouchable. Ivana approached, her hands folded tightly in front of her to hide the slight tremor in her fingers. She could feel Dante's predatory gaze tracking her movement, his brow furrowed in a permanent stare of suspicion. It was the kind of look that usually made Ivana shrink, a reminder of her place as the invisible girl in a world built for giants. Rosa sat down, her movements elegant but weary. As Ivana leaned in to place the menus, she caught a closer look at the older woman's face. Up close, the high-status mask flickered, revealing eyes that looked suddenly, inexplicably homesick as she stared at the white linen cloth. The atmosphere at the table was a suffocating mix of absolute power and a strange, buried nostalgia. Ivana knew she was supposed to disappear, to be the silent server Roberto demanded. But as she looked at Rosa, and then at the hardened, calculating man beside her, a spark of her grandmother's courage flickered in her mind. She realized she held a key to this fortress, a language of home that these powerful people hadn't heard in a lifetime. Straightening her spine, Ivana prepared to speak. Ivana stood at the edge of the table, the weight of 1,000 years of tradition and the cold gaze of modern power colliding in her chest. Her hands were folded tightly against her red apron, hiding the slight tremor in her fingers as she looked at Rosa Valastro. Roberto's warning echoed in her mind, to stay invisible, to be a ghost in a white collar. But as she saw the way Rosa touched her vintage gold locket, a piece of jewelry that looked exactly like the one Ivana's grandmother had been buried in, the shyness that usually anchored her tongue simply dissolved. Instead of the practiced English greeting she had rehearsed, Ivana straightened her spine and spoke in a low, melodic tone that cut through the clinking of crystal and the low hum of the restaurant. "Buonasera, signora. Benvenuta a New York," she whispered. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The heavy conversation between the bodyguards and the associates died mid-sentence. Dante Valastro, who had been leaning back with the casual authority of a king, froze. He didn't just look at her, he assessed her with a sharp, predatory intensity, his brow furrowing as he processed the sounds coming from this invisible girl. It wasn't just Italian, it was the thick, archaic Sicilian dialect of the Bolaro district, a regional tongue so specific that it acted like a secret handshake between those who truly belonged to the old soil. Rosa Valastro's hand stopped mid-air, her fork clattering softly against the fine china. Her jaw dropped in a look of pure, unadulterated shock, her eyes widening as if she had just heard a ghost speak. For 50 years, she had lived in the center of an American empire, surrounded by people who spoke the language of business and blood, but never the language of home. "It is an honor to have a daughter of Palermo in our house," Ivana continued, her voice gaining strength even as she felt the crushing weight of invisibility being stripped away. "I am Ivana. I will be at your service this evening." The room remained in a state of suspended animation. The bodyguards near the entrance shifted their weight, their eyes darting to Dante for a signal, but the boss didn't move. He slowly removed his sunglasses, his calculating gaze fixed on the waitress in the red apron. In that silence, the hierarchy of the restaurant flipped. Ivana was no longer a shy girl shrinking into the shadows. She was the holder of a key that had just unlocked a door into the most guarded hearts in Manhattan. Every guest sat frozen, caught in the gravity of a moment where the most dangerous table in the room had finally met something more powerful than fear, a memory. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled clatter of the kitchen. Rosa Valastro's hand, adorned with a shimmering diamond that usually signaled unshakable status, trembled as it moved to her throat. Her eyes, normally sharp and discerning, were wide and glassy, fixed on Ivana as if the young waitress were a ghost conjured from the Mediterranean mist. The Sicilian words hadn't just been spoken, they had landed like a physical weight, shattering the polished veneer of the Manhattan elite. Rosa's breath hitched, a jagged, broken sound that seemed to age her 10 years in an instant. Dante Valastro did not move, but his energy shifted from predatory to a cold, calculating curiosity. His brow furrowed deeply, his narrowed eyes tracking the way his mother's composure was disintegrating before his eyes. He looked from the waitress's pleading, desperate expression back to his mother's pale face, his mind working through the impossible probability of what had just occurred. This was a man who lived in a world of threats and leverage, yet he found himself confronted by something he couldn't immediately categorize or control. "Where did you hear that?" Dante's voice was a low, dangerous rasp, slicing through the silence. He leaned forward, his dark silhouette looming over the table, his gaze locked onto Ivana with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floorboards. Rosa didn't wait for the answer. She reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of Ivana's crisp white shirt, her voice barely a whisper. "The dialect. It is not just Sicilian. It is the language of the stones in Bolaro, she murmured, her English heavily accented and thick with a grief that had been suppressed for half a century. Tears began to track through her perfectly applied makeup, carving paths of vulnerability down her cheeks. Nobody speaks it here. Not like that. Not with the lilt of the old neighborhood. Ivana felt the air in her lungs grow thin, her hands still raised in a subconscious gesture of supplication. She looked at the powerful woman who was now weeping openly, and the man whose suspicion was slowly being replaced by a haunting recognition. The shadows of Palermo had officially entered the room, stretching across the white linen and the sparkling crystal, turning a high-stakes power dinner into a wake for a life they had all left behind. Dante sank back into the plush leather of the booth, his hand resting on the lion-headed cane, not as a weapon, but as an anchor, as he waited for the girl in the red apron to speak the name that would change everything. The heavy silence of the restaurant was finally broken, not by a shout, but by the soft, ragged exhale of a man who hadn't breathed properly in decades. Dante Valastro leaned forward, his predatory gaze replaced by a sharp, searching intensity as he repeated the name Ivana had just whispered. Ferrante. Beside him, Rosa's hand flew to her diamond-clad throat, her eyes brimming with a sudden, overwhelming moisture. Lucia Ferrante, Rosa whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the past. The girl who sang in the square of Bolaro. Ivana felt the air in the room shift. The looming thread of the syndicate seemed to evaporate, replaced by a raw, ancestral connection. Dante reached out, his calloused, powerful hand covering Ivana's trembling one with an unexpected and extraordinary gentleness. He began to speak, his voice dropping into a low, reverent tone as he looked at his mother. He told the table of a time in 1960, long before the tailored suits in the Empire, when the Valastros were just another family in Sicily with nothing to their name. He remembered Lucia, Ivana's grandmother, as the light of the neighborhood. While others closed their doors during the hardest winters, the Ferrantes always kept theirs open. He described how Lucia would stand in the center of the worn stone square at sunset, her voice rising in melodies that made the hungry forget their stomachs and the weary forget their toil. She didn't just share her bread, Dante said, his eyes fixed on Ivana's wide, tearful ones. She shared her spirit. My mother was a seamstress who worked until her fingers bled, and it was your grandmother who would bring her a cup of water and a song to keep her going. Rosa nodded fervently, a single tear escaping to trail down her cheek. She reached across the table to touch the fabric of Ivana's red apron, as if connecting with the lineage of the woman who had once been her only friend in a world of hardship. The table of dangerous, powerful men sat motionless, caught in the gravity of a story that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the debt of a soul. Ivana, the girl who had spent her life trying to be invisible, suddenly felt like the most important person in Manhattan. She realized then that her grandmother hadn't just left her a language, she had left her a legacy of kindness that even the most feared men in the city were bound to honor. Dante Valastro did not move, but the air around the table seemed to shift, losing its jagged edge of crystalline tension. He looked at Ivana, then back at his mother, whose hand was still trembling as she clutched her silk napkin. The silence of the restaurant, once a weapon of intimidation, had transformed into something hushed and reverent. Dante leaned back, the leather of the booth creaking softly, his sharp, calculating eyes never leaving Ivana's face. My father always said that a Ferrante never closed their door to a neighbor, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, resonant tone that carried the weight of a decree. And the Valastros never leave a debt unpaid. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. There was no signature on the front, only her name written in a precise, forceful script. He slid it across the white linen tablecloth toward her. Roberto mentioned you spend your days in classrooms and your nights in this apron, trying to build a bridge to a life that doesn't involve carrying trays, Dante said, a rare ghost of a smile touching his lips. Consider the bridge built. Ivana's breath hitched as she looked down at the envelope. She tried to shake her head, her instinctive shyness flaring up one last time, an urge to shrink back into the shadows of the service station. "I can't. I didn't do this for a reward, sir," she whispered, her voice thick with the remnants of the dialect that had started it all. But it was Rosa who reached out, her diamond-clad fingers covering Ivana's hand with a warmth that felt like a blessing. "It is not a reward, Kara," the matriarch said softly. "It is recognition. You gave my son back the sound of his mother's voice. You gave me a piece of a home I thought was lost to the sea." Dante nodded once, a sharp, non-negotiable gesture of finality. "The tuition is handled, all of it. From this moment, your only job is to become the nurse your grandmother believed you could be." As Ivana took the envelope, the crushing weight that had lived in her chest for years, the constant tallying of rent, textbooks, and missed meals, simply evaporated. The predatory aura of the table had vanished, replaced by a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her grandmother's passing. She wasn't just a waitress in a red apron anymore. She was a Ferrante girl, seen and honored by the only people in Manhattan who truly understood the value of where she came from. As the table erupted into the warm, loud chaos of a family meal, Ivana walked back toward the kitchen, her spine straighter, her eyes clear, stepping finally into the light of her own new life. 6 months after the fundraiser that secured her future, Ivana stepped off a dusty bus into the heart of Palermo. The air here was different, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, sea salt, and the kind of heat that felt like a permanent embrace. She made her way through the winding, narrow streets until the modern world seemed to peel away, leaving behind the ancient, sun-drenched stones of the Bolaro district. Following the directions Dante Valastro had given her, she found it. The square. It was smaller than she had imagined, a quiet courtyard surrounded by weathered buildings with laundry flapping like white flags from wrought iron balconies. In the center stood a small stone fountain, its water a rhythmic trickle that had likely been the soundtrack to her grandmother's childhood. Ivana stood in the exact spot Victor Sr. had described, the place where a young girl named Lucia Ferrante used to stand on Sunday evenings. The golden light of the setting sun painted the square in hues of honey and amber, casting long, soft shadows against the pavement. She felt a sudden, sharp ache of longing, wishing her grandmother could see her now, not as the shy girl hiding in the kitchen, but as a woman who had crossed an ocean to claim her history. Taking a deep breath, Ivana began to sing. Her voice, once hesitant and soft, rose with a newfound clarity, filling the empty square with the ancient melodic lullaby her grandmother had whispered to her every night in their cramped New York apartment. The Sicilian words felt right in her mouth, like they were finally returning to the soil that grew them. As the final notes drifted upward toward the balconies, the square remained still, but the heavy silence no longer felt empty. An old woman leaning over a railing above nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. For a moment, the distance between the Upper East Side and this ancient square vanished. Ivana realized that she wasn't just a nurse or a waitress, she was the living bridge between two worlds. The invisible girl had finally found her voice, and in the quiet of the Bolaro sunset, she knew that Lucia and the neighborhood were finally listening. Ivana's story proves that the world might see a waitress, but your ancestors see a warrior. Your language, your culture, and your history are keys that can open doors even the most powerful men cannot close. If this story reminded you that your roots are your greatest strength, please like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss a story about the hidden power within us all. Drop a comment below with a word from your heritage that brings you comfort. Let's keep our traditions alive together.